But one of them at Politico says is like Walz's wide eyes showed his passion and emotional intensity. Can we show that? There is his wide eyes. That humans would widen their eyes to convey that danger is close. What emotion are you getting from that? Sorry.
Greg Gutfeld doesn't waste time when he goes after someone like Tim Walz. There's no slow buildup, just a full-speed verbal attack, fueled by confidence and a smirk. When the Minnesota governor handed him plenty of material through policy mistakes, public slip-ups, and political mixed signals, Gutfeld jumped in like someone who had been waiting all day for the cue. He didn't just roast him. He broke it down with sharp humor and steady pressure, turning each mistake into a punchline that hit harder than the last.
Walz is weird, but he disguises it under the costume of phony compassion, a fake politician who masks destructive ideas under the guise of empathy. At a 2017 town hall, he implied 10-year-old boys should be able to invade girls' bathrooms because
First, Greg went after the image Tim Walz was trying to sell. Walz wanted to come across as a down-to-earth middle American leader, like wearing a flannel shirt suddenly made him Lincoln with Wi-Fi. Gutfeld shredded that image with ease, joking that mentioning farmers in a speech or standing by a tractor didn't automatically make him relatable. The flannel didn't fool Greg, and he made sure nobody else fell for it either.
Since his only attack was that the other guy was weird. Because everyone is weird, the more you get to know them. It's why marriage is a commitment. Over time, both spouses realize we're all bat crazy. But there's weird and there's dangerously insane.
Greg made it clear that Walz's version of hard work probably meant turning a 5-minute press conference into a long-winded talk about nothing. Then came the pandemic throwbacks. Greg went straight at Walz's lockdowns and mandates, calling his approach a slow march through common sense. He pointed out how Walz kept flipping positions, like a cat trying to land on both sides of a fence, never quite sticking the landing.
If you ever want to know what the Dems are up to, just listen to what they accuse you of doing. Take the word weird. It was first uttered by a guy named Tim Walz, directed at another guy called J.D. Vance. But turns out, as usual, it's a preemptive projection. For the Dems always call you on stuff that they're about to do or have already done. They accuse you of election interference before they do it. They accuse you of racism before they do it. They accuse you of censorship right before they try to...
One day it was stay home, stay safe, and the next it was open carefully, but not too much, and only if the wind's blowing southwest. Gutfeld joked that Walz was getting his policy tips from a magic 8-ball and his public health advice from a horoscope. He had a field day with the confusion, ripping into the double standards that popped up during Walz's time like weeds in a forgotten garden.
It's hard to even bring him up. He has a resting snitch face, you know? I mean, he forfeited his man card during COVID and the riots. And you're right. And also, at that diner, of course, he left early. So don't you find it weird that for a terrifying threat to democracy that Trump is, not a single interviewer in his history has approached him with trepidation. If anything, they come at him, often with brutal questions about lawsuits, about affairs, everything is...
Greg highlighted the ridiculousness of Walz's pandemic rules, pointing out how small businesses were forced to close while big box stores stayed fully open, bright, and busy. Apparently, in Walz's world, the virus couldn't survive under fluorescent lights or near discounted patio furniture, Minnesota-style science apparently. But Greg didn't stop at the policies. He went after the panic. He mocked how Walz seemed to confuse leadership with stage fright, describing his speeches as dramatic readings of apocalyptic fiction, full of vague warnings and lines like, "We're at a tipping point," political code for, "We have no idea what we're doing, but it sounds serious." Greg joked that if Walz gave GPS directions, every route would end in a U-turn and a nervous apology. Then he turned to the summer riots. While neighborhoods burned and stores were looted live on TV, Walz hesitated like a student hoping the teacher forgot about the quiz. Gutfeld roasted the governor's initial refusal to call in the National Guard, painting him as a man who couldn't make a decision without checking with his dog, a houseplant, and a group chat full of passive-aggressive advisors. It was leadership by committee, if the committee was terrified and indecisive.
Whose expertise does he rely upon for his Midwestern takes? Here's Minnesota State Rep Leigh Finke, who wants to train more children's doctors on sex change surgery and puberty blockers. He sponsored the Trans Refuge Bill, which Walz signed, which makes Minnesota a sanctuary state for such butchery.
If you promise trans refuge, then we need to increase the number of people who are offering.
And when Walz finally took action, Greg made it clear it wasn't leadership, it was cleanup. The kind of political janitor work that only starts after the fire department has gone home. He called it leadership by rear view mirror, always reacting after the damage was done, issuing a press release before a plan. Then came the economy. Greg couldn't resist ripping into Walz's tax policies, calling them a buffet of bad ideas, where the main course was confusion with a side of businesses leaving the state. He joked that if you took a shot every time a company left Minnesota under Walz, you'd need a liver transplant by lunch. Walz's economic strategy was like throwing darts blindfolded while spinning in circles. The board was on fire and the darts were being taxed. Then Greg moved on to education. Even though Walz was a former teacher, Minnesota's schools under his watch fared worse than a spam email from a Nigerian prince. Test scores fell, graduation rates stalled, and teachers were stuck between useless mandates and lesson plans from consultants who hadn't seen a classroom since chalkboards were cutting edge. Greg laughed that under Walz, the only thing students were learning fast was how not to learn. It was reform by regression, with no pop quiz in sight.
There are other weird things about Walz, of course. He fibs about his military service. He set up a snitch line to narc on citizens for not wearing masks outside. And he's super weird on free speech.
I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
There's no guarantee. What? I guess his class didn't cover the First Amendment, but if misinformation...
But it wasn't just Walz's policies or leadership style that Gutfeld went after. It was the carefully crafted, painfully awkward attempt at being relatable. Greg mocked how Walz tried to come across as a working-class dad, but ended up more like a substitute teacher lost on the way to the break room. The rolled-up sleeves, the over-the-top smiles, the forced empathy. It all felt like a high school play where the lead forgot his lines but kept going because he remembered the hand gestures. Greg also targeted the performative politics, the town halls that solved nothing, the listening sessions where no one actually listened, and the endless panels, task forces, and pilot programs designed more for headlines than results. He pointed out that Walz spent more time managing optics than outcomes, a strategy that might work on a reality show but is a disaster when you're running a state. And the press conferences? Greg called them long-winded lectures disguised as updates, where Walz could talk for 20 minutes and say absolutely nothing, all while wearing the look of a man who just realized he left the oven on.
You lost because you weren't woke enough? That's like telling Joy Behar she's not eating enough Doritos. That's like Jasmine Crockett saying, I gotta black this up. That's like Bud Light saying, hey, you know what? We could use more Dylan Mulvaney. But even Kamala's not that clueless, and that's saying something. Walz also seemed to doubt the validity of the last election.
Gutfeld joked that watching a Walz briefing was like trying to read instructions printed in invisible ink. Long, confusing, and completely useless. The best part, he didn't even need to exaggerate. The material was already absurd. All he had to do was hold up a mirror, add a laugh track in his mind, and let the ridiculousness speak for itself. His roast wasn't angry, it was precise. He wasn't yelling, he was smirking, and that made it hit even harder. Gutfeld didn't sound outraged. He sounded entertained, like a man who had stumbled onto a comedy goldmine that refilled itself every time Walz opened his mouth or signed another baffling executive order. That kind of roast, sharp, amused, and just annoyed enough, was far more devastating than any loud rant. Gutfeld didn't make Walz look evil, he made him look ridiculous. And in politics, ridicule is the real kiss of death. People might forgive a tyrant, but they never forget a clown. The best part, Gutfeld left the door wide open. He knows Walz will keep giving more material, whether it's a half-baked policy, a dramatic pause mid-speech, or a press release full of buzzwords pretending to be logic. With Walz, the show never ends.
As a teacher, my number one responsibility in the classroom is the safety, security, and belongingness of every single child in that room. These are children my son's age, a fourth grader, a 10-year-old, who just wants to go to the bathroom. and their identity is they are male or female, and they just go in that bathroom and use it, end quote. Sounds so folksy, you know? Belongingness. Yeah, they'll be belonging in therapy with this guy there.
Tim Walz wasn't just roasted, he was filleted, seasoned, and served with a side of Minnesota Nice and a double helping of common sense. Greg Gutfeld took the myth of Walz, put it under a microscope, and exposed it as nothing more than a stack of press clippings held together with duct tape and wishful thinking. And just like that, the roast kept going, because in political comedy, some punchlines practically write themselves. Just when it seemed like he might be done, Gutfeld launched a second round, this time with even sharper aim. He zeroed in on Walz's obsession with commissions and advisory boards, pointing out the irony of a man who built a full-time government staff filled with people who seem to specialize in doing absolutely nothing. According to Gutfeld, Walz treats task forces like Oprah treats giveaways. You get a board, you get a council, everybody gets a committee. The only problem? None of them ever solve anything. They just write reports, hold meetings, and produce results that sound like horoscopes written by unpaid interns. Then, Greg went for the cherry on top, Minnesota's rising crime wave. And here, the punchlines weren't just writing themselves, they were practically begging for airtime.
With this administration and the spouse swapping of the VP and the president, we saw it before. Like, Dr. Jill didn't kiss Joe like that.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And now he couldn't wait to get that full embrace. It wasn't a bro hug, it was a yo hug. And he put his wife in the friend zone.
Yes.
It's always, that must have been a fun car ride home.
Yeah.
Why can't you hug me like her husband? I mean, it's
yeah.
weird.
It is weird. You know, Joey, I think that it's okay to take Waltz's picadillos, if you call it, apart, because remember, he broke the seal by calling Vance weird, and we're all weird, including him.
Greg Gutfeld tore into Walz's strange talent for acting like rising crime rates were just a trick of the media. While stores boarded up their windows and residents installed floodlights and home security systems like fortresses, Walz still stood behind a microphone insisting things were improving. Greg Gutfeld compared it to a firefighter standing in front of a burning house, claiming the heat was just part of a new neighborhood spa program. He also mocked how Walz seemed to treat criminals more like misunderstood life coaches than actual threats. Cutting penalties while wondering why people didn't feel safe made no sense. Greg Gutfeld said, "If you keep petting a bear and calling it a misunderstood raccoon, don't be shocked when your picnic basket disappears and your tent gets shredded." Then came infrastructure, and Greg Gutfeld had a field day with the potholes. He said Minnesota's roads under Walz looked like they'd been carpet bombed by bored toddlers with jackhammers. This wasn't normal wear and tear, it was active neglect dressed up as long-term planning. Greg Gutfeld joked that you don't drive through Minnesota anymore, you go off-roading in a sedan. But it wasn't just about policy, it was about the pattern. And Greg Gutfeld saw that same pattern everywhere.
I speak of former VP nominee Tim Walz. He joined Beto O'Rourke at a Texas town hall last night, and the estrogen levels were enough to give Chuck Norris menstrual cramps. I wonder, is our strength our diversity?
Our strength is our diversity. We've been talking about this for years as a country of immigrants, and we let them define the issue on immigration. We let them define the issue on DEI, and we let them define what woke is.
Greg also called out Walz's tone-deaf PR moves. Speeches that start with over-the-top empathy but end with empty lines like we're doing everything we can, even when the results clearly say otherwise. He mocked Walz's attempts to blend in with working-class folks, like a man playing undercover boss in his own state. Greg said the performance falls flat when your empathy sounds like an AI robot learning emotions from soap operas. And Walz's communication? Greg compared it to someone trying to defuse a bomb while reading Braille. Everything vague, over-explained, and packed with enough buzzwords to fill an entire corporate retreat handbook.
I want to see this in slow motion. You'll see Walz extends his hand to his wife. She grabs it, they shake, he pulls her close, and then goes in for that non-friction hug, all the while still shaking her hand. I wish there was a word to describe that. Oh.
Greg Gutfeld joked that if you played a drinking game where you took a sip every time Walz used phrases like robust dialogue or community-centered approach, you'd be legally unconscious before the end of a single town hall. Then came the kicker. Greg Gutfeld speculated on what Walz might do if re-elected. More programs, more boards, and more meaningless slogans plastered on yard signs. He painted a vivid picture of Minnesota turning into a museum of failed ideas, curated by a governor too busy hosting advisory brunches to notice the roof was caving in. The crowd loved it because when Greg Gutfeld roasts someone, it's not just personal, it's public service. He says what most people want to say but can't, either because they're too polite or afraid of getting canceled. Greg Gutfeld doesn't care. He just laughs, points out the absurdity, and reminds everyone that the emperor might have a press team, but he still forgot his pants.